So it is Easter. This is Palm Sunday, but we're doing a series, Easter series on the Bible, talking about the story of the Bible, how we got our Bible, how it came together. And the reason why I'm doing that is because the reason, the focal point that we talked about almost every week now, the reason why we have the Bible is because of an event that took place. And the event is what we celebrate next Sunday, and that's resurrection, okay? So that's the whole reason for our series. So today is Palm Sunday. Some of my friends ask me if I hand out palms, and we don't do that here, but that's a fun tradition, I think. The palms were representative of praise and adoration towards somebody, and so when Jesus entered Jerusalem, this being Good Friday, the culmination of the season of Lent, right? Beginning of Holy Week, they would put palm fronds and any clothing and stuff like that on the ground as he entered into Jerusalem. So that's what today is, okay? So we're going to continue on in our series on the Bible and how the Bible came together. A little bit of background. We all remember that there are how many books in the Bible? Anybody remember? 66 books in the Bible, exactly right. Now, the interesting thing about the Bible is this. The Bible is more like a library than it is a book, okay? Where you have other holy books like the Quran is just one book kind of written by one person, and you have the Bhagavad Gita and things like that that are very different than the Bible. So the Bible is 66 different documents separated into two different parts, which we're going to talk about today, the Old and the New Testaments or covenants. And it was written over a period of, you might be interested in knowing, written over a period of maybe a span of 15 to 1800 years. So it wasn't like written in 1 year. It was a span of time that it was written. And it was written by some 40 different authors. And yet the Bible is one, as hopefully we'll develop today, is one continuous story. Now that's not to say there aren't things in there that may be contradictory, seeming to be, right? Well, that's just natural. That's natural when you have people that multiple people that see and watch the same account. They give a different account of that event. Isn't that right? I mean, police know that when they interview people at the scene of an accident or a crime. If everybody tells the exact same story, you know what they do? They just throw it out. They assume that everybody kind of talked together, got their story straight, and told it that way. To me, this is evidence that even like the Gospels are really factual accounts of what happened. And so you'll find that there are historians today that they'll say, well, you know, it's most likely that we don't really know that Jesus was a real person in history. We just have the Gospels and a few other things. Well, the people that are saying that are people who don't want to have to face the fact that Jesus actually lived and he is who he says he is, right? There are other historians who, would say, no, I think the documentation is pretty clear that Jesus is a historical figure. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off last week. That was just a little introductory part. So where we left off last week was this. The big idea of Genesis 1 wasn't how God, you can put this in your notes if you want, wasn't how God created the world. The big idea that Moses was writing, again, that's even kind of maybe debated who the author was, but for the sake of just our study in the Bible, this series, that Moses was the author, okay? We'll just leave it at that. That Moses was trying to say that God created the world, not how he created the world. And really, in his time, he dropped a bomb because it was thought that all different sorts of things, a multiplicity of gods, and the very beginning, he has this unparalleled, untested worldview. And it would become what we know as, have you ever heard the phrase, the golden rule? This would become to be what we know as the golden rule. And this golden rule, what we find is not reflected in nature. It's actually not reflected in human nature. But this was the big idea that was introduced at the very beginning. The idea introduced was that God created man in his own image. And the idea is this: you are not a means to an end. You are the pinnacle of God's creation. God said this: I'm going to make you as much like me as I possibly can. Did you ever think of it that way before? God said, I'm going to make you in my image as much like me as I possibly can. That means this: every person, everyone that you come in contact with is or bears the image of the one true God. So let me just pause here and just say this to all of us. Be very careful how you treat an image bearer. Right? Now, we all know that there are some knuckleheads out there. Isn't that right? Maybe even in here. But they're still image bearers. Now, according to the Enuma Elish, you were created to be a slave of the gods. And even maybe to the new atheist, you're a slave to your DNA. You have no free will, and there's no redemption, there's no afterlife. But in the very beginning, right, don't miss this, God introduces us to himself, a God who saves. This is in your notes. We're introduced to a God who saves, who redeems, who delivers. And now listen, look at me, look here. Who never, ever, 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 ever gives up on you. You have to know that. You have to know that that's the God we're introduced at the very, very beginning. A God who never gives up on us. And all of this from day one. A God who gives you freedom to choose. And a God who gives you freedom to choose, and then he honors your choice. I don't know how much you've given thought to this, about what free will is and what it means, but we have freedom to choose God, and we have freedom to choose not God. And then from the very beginning, Yahweh does the most ungodly-like thing. He starts the process to reverse the consequences of our choosing not him. So Genesis 1 gives us this big picture, if you will, this meta-narrative, the ultimate context for our human experience, this monotheistic worldview. And it's a worldview, friends, that answers life's most challenging questions. And those are the why questions. Have you ever thought of that? Why is there something rather than nothing? Have you asked yourself that? Why are you here? Why do you even matter? Well, from the very beginning, the idea is that you're here for a purpose, and you are here with a purpose. You're not an accident. You're not just random chance. You weren't created by some conflict of the gods. And friends, you weren't created by the universe, because the universe itself was created. Now, God wanted image bearers. He wanted image bearers that could relate to one another, and he wanted image bearers who could know and relate to him. Friends, this is God's desire. This is what he wanted. And here's the really good part. The really good part is this, that when the time was right, in other words, when everything was just as it needed to be, when everything was in place, Yahweh, the Creator God, joined us. But that's still to come. You have to wait for that. So back to the story of first century. The Gentiles saw that the Jews, the Hebrews, had it right all along. And this made them even more interested in the Hebrew text. So this is where we come today, where we're going to talk about today, the Hebrew text, and how the Hebrew text became part of the Bible that we have today, what we call the Old Testament. Okay? So they moved very quickly when they found that the Hebrew scriptures talked about one God. This one God that they were being told there is only one God, and this is the God. And they found out in the Hebrew scriptures, wow, they have always believed in just one God. And so they became enamored with Jesus, and they became enamored with the scriptures, the text for the Hebrew people. So the stage was now set for the inclusion of the Hebrew Holy Scriptures to be part of the Christian writing. But this inclusion wouldn't come without difficulty. Now, here's the thing that gets kind of complicated, okay? So I don't know how long I'll spend on this. I may have to develop it for a while, but what we said last week is the Gentiles, they didn't embrace the Hebrew scriptures as Jewish scriptures. This is important. Do you follow me? So these writings were from Hebrews for Hebrews. And when the Gentiles came across them, they were interested in them not because of any history or anything that had to pertaining with the Jews. Their culture, anything that they knew, they weren't interested in that. They embraced these texts. Now imagine this. Imagine you're a Hebrew, and these are your holy scriptures, and another group comes along and says, oh no, we're going to take those, yours, from your history, from your experience, from everything that you are, your culture, we're going to take those and we're going to make them ours. Now the funny thing is that they couldn't even read the Hebrew scriptures. And so they took these scriptures and they made them their own. Now, they were interested in these texts for one reason. You can write this in your notes. This might be a new word for you, maybe it's not. They were interested in these texts for Christological reasons. You ever heard that term before? Kind of a big term. It's really simple. Christological. They were looking at them to where they could find Christ, the Messiah, Jesus, in those texts. They didn't care what the Hebrews thought about. They didn't even care. This is fascinating to me. So the Hebrews might say, well, this means this to us. They go, we don't care what it means to you. This is what it now means to us. And so this is important. They began to read the Hebrew scriptures, and guess what? They found Jesus everywhere in the Hebrew scriptures, even where he was not. This is immensely important, friends, immensely important. They found all kinds of texts that they decided were about Jesus, and you know what? They were not about Jesus. They were not. And this posed you wonder why there's such a division in that day between Jews and Christians, right? This is the main reason. They're saying, we seem to go, no, that's not what that's about. Oh, no, that's what it is to us. That's what it means to us. You can't even read Hebrew. I know, but we got, I mean, it's just crazy. So the Gentiles actually absolutely just rejected Hebrew interpretation of their own text. Just flat out rejected it. Here's what the Gentiles did. The Gentiles got the Hebrew text and they baptized it, they Christianized it, and they allegorized it. That's what they did. And friends, this is really important, okay? So we get our understanding of Hebrew scriptures not from the Hebrews. We get our understanding of the Hebrew scriptures through Gentile eyes. That's what handed it down to you and I today, through Gentile eyes, not through Hebrew eyes. So if you talk to a Hebrew person about their holy scriptures and what it means to them, it'll sound and look different than from a Christian viewpoint. This is really, really important. When I was in school, there were some seminary students that went to Israel, and they met these rabbis and everything, and they asked them they had a list of all these questions. But one of the questions that they relayed to us at school was, they asked them, they said, do you think that the story of Noah, that was a true story of an ark and animals? You know what the rabbis said? Wow, we never thought of it like that. And they began to talk amongst themselves. Wow, could that have been a true story? Like they didn't see it that way. And so the way in which the Gentiles saw and read the Hebrew scriptures was so different, right? And I think a really, really important idea, and that's this, is that the Christians, the Gentile Christians, they downplayed this epic story of the Hebrews that's in the Hebrew Bible. They downplayed it. See, the Old Testament chronicles God's redemptive. Okay, so here's another big term for you. There's a book that I read a number of years ago, and the idea of the book is this: that through the Bible, what we see is, my friends know this word I tell them, it's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is your interpretation and application of Scripture, okay? So exegesis is understanding it in its cultural context, which we do all the time. It's very important to do. You understand it first in its cultural context, and then you make a hermeneutic. You understand it, you interpret it, right, based on its historical context and what it means today, and then you apply it to your life. Well, there's this idea of redemptive movement hermeneutics. And what that means is this. What that means is all throughout the Bible as we read it, we have to understand it from its cultural context and see the trajectory of the movement of redemption. It doesn't happen like this. God's always throughout history is moving in a redemptive fashion, in a redemptive direction. Okay? That's an important thing to keep up here when we talk about what we see in the Old Testament. So God starts out in Genesis 1, Genesis 2 as creator God. We talked about that, right? He's creator God, but real quick, he moves to another, he puts on another hat, as it were, and that next hat is founder God. He becomes founder God to found a nation through which, now remember what I just told you, through which redemption of mankind can take place. Redemption of the world. And he begins, so I have a couple blanks there for you if you're taking notes. First one is write down Abraham, because he begins with a man who has no family, he has no children. And through Abraham, God says, I'm going to birth a nation, multi-generational, a nation with a purpose. A nation that would ultimately be enslaved in Egypt. Last night we were at Tammy and Lionel's, and we went downstairs. He put on his big TV, and right on the screen, who watched last night? It was the Ten Commandments on last night. Anybody watch it? You watched it last night. Ten Commandments were on. The nation would eventually be enslaved in Egypt, and then later on by a superpower. But when they were in Egypt, they were enslaved by a Pharaoh who considered himself to be like a god, or at least related to the gods. You can imagine how that turned out. And so then God sends his servant Moses, the Savior Moses, as it were, and he goes into this environment, the environment of Pharaoh, and he says, let my people go. He speaks on behalf of God. Now, he spoke to Pharaoh. God spoke to Pharaoh in the only way that a Pharaoh would understand. He spoke to him in terms of violence and power, right? Because that's what a Pharaoh understands. And at the end of this amazing story, he frees the Hebrews, and they leave Egypt, and they leave it rich. They plunder, they take all the riches from Egypt, and the people in Egypt are glad to see these Hebrew people leave. And Moses then leads them to the wilderness, and he goes to Mount Sinai. And it's there where God established the covenant with the Hebrew people. You all know the story. Moses goes up on the mountain, comes back with what? Yeah, he come back with 613 commandments. Not 10. Back with 613 commandments. You can read those commandments. You can see those, especially in Leviticus. And what he says is this. What these commandments are is this. God says to the Hebrew people, listen, you are going to be my people, and I'm going to be your God. But here's the deal. You're going to be different than the surrounding nations. See, when we read the Old Testament, as a matter of fact, Pete and I have a friend. He was a football coach from high school, and Pete coached with them. And he's probably, 10 years older than us, Pete, something like that. for the first time, he's kind of told Pete and Connie, he picked up the Bible and he started reading it. Well, he started in the Old Testament, and he's talking to them going, what the, right? What's going on here? Like, what's going on in this thing? I don't get it. This God seems like, wow. I thought he was loving and everything. You don't see that in the Old Testament. But here's the thing, friends. What we don't see is how God, when we read how God was asking the Hebrew people to live and behave, it sounds barbaric and archaic to us, where we are now. But in the time, what you have to realize is this, is that God was asking them to live way different than the surrounding nations. And so, he basically says this, you're going to be my people, and I'm going to be your God, and through you, I'm going to bless the entire world. And he said this, he said there are rules. How many know there are rules in the Old Testament? Right? There's some rules there. Have you ever read them? Huh? Some of them? Some? Well, make the time. Make it. So he has these rules, this covenant. Basically what God says is this. He says to the Hebrew people, everybody knows what a contract is, right? That's basically what it is. I'm going to make a contract with you. And he said, now listen, you're going to be my people. Now pay close attention. He says this. When you obey what I tell you, you're going to be blessed. And when you don't, you're going to be punished. Sound like a parent to you? Huh? A little bit? Right? Listen, you do what I say, you're going to be good. You're going to, And that as they get older, that kind of changes a little bit. We'll get into that a little bit, right? But you'll be punished. He said, if you embrace the way of your surrounding nations, if you embrace them, I'm basically going to give you over to them, right? If you're not going to set yourself apart, I want you to set yourself apart for a reason, to be an example for the entire world, so that I can bless the entire world, all nations, through you. But if you don't, if you embrace the ways of the surrounding nation, well, I'm going to give you over to them, so you can see exactly what it's like. And that's what happens throughout the Old Testament. So the covenant, the contract, was conditional in one sense. In one sense, it was conditional because if you obey, you'll be blessed. But it was unconditional in the sense that God says, but listen, you will always be my people. You'll always be my people. And all this was outlined when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 613 commandments. Can I just pause here just for a minute? And I want to talk a little bit about these laws and so forth, right? Because sometimes they seem, so see that, and that's what some people might say, oh yeah, see, all the laws, God's just trying to steal all of our joy and happiness and that kind of stuff. No. So in the Old Testament, in this covenant, in Leviticus 18 especially, what we see is these laws, especially in chapter 18, are these sexual prohibitions, okay? And in there are 19 different sexual prohibitions, like stuff dealing with sexuality. And what God was saying to the Hebrew people is, listen, I want you to be different than everybody, all the nations around you. I want you to live in a different way. Now, today, currently, just about every single developed nation and some other developing nations embrace, or it's either legal or they embrace them, or they're illegal or they frown upon 17 of the 19 found in Leviticus 18. Now the point here is that the laws that God gave the Hebrew people were way, way, way ahead of their time. Here's a sort of theme in the prohibition. No one, this is in the Bible, okay? No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. Seems reasonable enough to me. You too? Right? Now, however, in the day, that didn't seem reasonable for the people of the day. They're saying, what? I can't believe it. Now listen, Now, the Romans would eventually adopt that later on, like the time of Jesus, first century. The Romans would even adopt that, not have sexual relations with a close relative. However, over in Egypt, right, the pharaohs, they were still marrying siblings. It would take generations for them to catch up to the things that God was establishing with the Hebrew people. So the Sinai Covenant. The Sinai Covenant is this moral and civil code that when understood, now this is really, it seems simple, but it's really important, that this moral and civil code, when understood in its cultural context, friends, it was absolutely brilliant. Now, every historian knows that you cannot just pull out, and listen, friends, Christians try to do this today, but every historian knows you cannot pull things out of its ancient cultural context and drop it into modern world and try to have some sort of try to make sense. Do you follow me? You can't just do that, right? So here's an idea that God is a good father who always accommodates to our capacity. Write that down if you're taking notes. God is a good father who always accommodates, and I'll explain it what I mean in a minute, always accommodates to our capacity. Your 5-year-old comes to you and says, Mom, Dad, where do babies come from? Well, there's an answer for a 5-year-old, right? You don't want to lie to them, but there's a way that you tell a 5-year-old where babies come from. Isn't that true? Your 16-year-old comes to you and says, where do babies come from? You tell them, right? It doesn't sound like it's a 5-year-old. There's a little bit more detail in it, right? A medical student, right? You ask a medical student, where do babies come from? Completely different level, isn't it? Right? And so God is a good father who always accommodates to our capacity. So you might look and go, wow, how could they have believed that, I believe some of these things. It's because God is accommodating to their capacity of where they were. Now remember the idea that I told you, redemptive movement hermeneutics. Redemptive movement. God is always taking them from this place to that place in a straight direction of redemption. But always where they currently are. So some of us here, a lot of us here are old enough to remember when they first started printing on cigarette packages that they may cause cancer, right? Remember that? Thing is, they knew a long time before that it caused cancer. But you can't just change things. It takes time to change things. In Canada, I understand in Canada, and I don't think it's a law here yet, in Canada, it is illegal to smoke in your own car with a child in your car. It's illegal. That seems reasonable, doesn't it? It's not here. It's not here. So my point is this. My point is that maybe, oftentimes, no matter where we are in the Bible, maybe God's ultimate ethic isn't even in here. Do you follow me? His ultimate ethic. Well, his ultimate ethic is in here, and his ultimate ethic is this, is that we love one another. That's his ultimate ethic, that we love one another. Everything else falls in line to that, into us loving one another as his image bearers. That's his ultimate ethic. So when we read other things, we see God saying a certain thing. Well, yeah, it's not his ultimate ethic, but he's taking them from where they are to the next step. Does this make sense? And this is what we find all throughout the whole Old Testament. Now, let's move on, because we're under the Sinai Covenant, right? And after that, the Israelites decide, Michelle, give me a cup of water. The Israelites decide that they wanted a king. Now, I'm just telling you like the big 30,000-foot view over the Old Testament. There's a lot of stuff in here, but this is kind of like the main points, right? So they decide they want a king. God did not want them to have a king. But what did God give us? Free will. Free will. See, God always wanted to be their king, but they wanted to be like the other nation. Like, okay, you want a king? I'll give you a king. And what happens when you get a king? We all know what happens when you get a king, because we all have those in our life, right? So, most of the kings were disastrous. Let's just put it that way. They were disastrous, and that's kind of the nature of kings, don't you think? Somebody who holds all the cards and all the power tend to be disastrous, tend to be tyrants. Then after they got their third king, they got what the other nations had around them, and that's a temple. After they got their third king, they got a temple. Now, why do they have a temple? Because all the nations had a temple. If you have a temple, the reason why you have a temple is for a god. So all the nations had their temples for their gods. And inside their temples was some sort of niche or whatever where they had a image of their god. But God told the Hebrews, you are to have no image of me, no idol of me. Why? He says, because listen, because I am the God and I cannot be bound to no image. I want you worshiping no image because I am alive and going to live with you. And so, but you may know they had their own little niche, right? It's called the Holy of Holies. But there was no image in the Holy of Holies. As a matter of fact, guess what they found when the veil was rent in two? He wasn't there. Because why? Because God said, I can't be contained to a space. I can't be limited to your finite mind of what you think I am and try to set up some space or image to contain me. I am the creator God, the founder of everything. But they wanted the temple, and so they got it. But he says, I don't live in any man-made structure, in any house like that. No. So then, as is necessary, the kings are, kind of, behaving badly. You ever see those TV shows, people behaving badly? You probably have one like that with the kings behaving badly. And so what God does is God sends a number of prophets to come along. To do what? Well, to primarily addressing a problem that existed. Now this is important. Pay attention. The prophets came to address a problem that was existing at the time and to give correction to the kings that had got their nation into trouble. But then, every once in a while, not as often as the Gentiles thought, but every once in a while, the prophets would see, as it were, beyond their historical context, to a future day when God would do something through the nation of Israel for the nations of the world. I want to read something to you. This was written 600 years before Jesus. It was written by a prophet by the name of Isaiah. And when he wrote it, the readers did not understand it. It seemed to be such a mystery to them. He talked about this suffering servant, which didn't kind of make sense to them. Can I read it to you? Do you mind? Isaiah 53. He says this. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. But he was pierced for our transgression. Who's he? That's what they were asking. He was pierced for our transgression. Who is the he? Jesus. Who is that? He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. For he was cut off from the land of the living. In other words, he died for our transgressions of my people. He was punished. For the transgression of my people, he was punished. And he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. And after he has suffered, who is he? he will see the light of life. In other words, he'll be alive again. You realize 600 years before Jesus, this prophet is somehow, in some way, seeing beyond his historical context and seeing a future time when God would do something powerful in the world. And he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Friends, here's the thing. I don't know where you are, I don't know what you think or whatever, or, this is something to consider. I heard a story of a seminary professor, and he was a Jewish man, and he was teaching in a Christian seminary. And he told the story of when he was in school, he was roomed with a Christian, and this Christian guy would always talk to him about Jesus, and he was Jewish. And so one day he hand wrote out what I just read to you on a piece of paper, folded up and gave it to him. He said, I just want you to read this. And so he read it, and he said it was from Isaiah, and he said, this is in Isaiah? I've never read this before. So he went to his synagogue, to his rabbi, and he gave it to him. He said, is this in our scriptures? Well, yeah, it is. He said, who's the he? And the rabbi said, well, kind of sounds a lot like Jesus, doesn't it? And he said, well, yeah. He said, well, yeah, but we don't believe that. We don't believe that. Which I get it, right? There are many people today that'll say exactly the same thing. What's this right there? Yeah, I know, but I don't believe that. Fair enough. Fair enough. So he went home and started looking at him for himself, and he finally became a follower of Jesus. So I read this, another pastor wrote this, about this whole idea of God in history, that God wades into the fray and plays by the rules of the kingdoms of this world. Right? Right? The rules that we exist here. He's not usurping these things in order to usher in a kingdom that is not of this world. You see, friends, here's the deal. The Old Testament, like Coach Dumb's finding out, it's rough. But here's the thing. To sand off the edges of that roughness is to miss what God has always wanted to do in this world. Do you follow me? Right? There were some bad times, some screwed up ways. People behaved like people behaved badly today. But to sand off those rough edges, to try to make God all the way through be this nice, kind, sweet God, right? It's not the way God dealt throughout all of history. It's just sanding off the rough edges like he's doing in our life. Are you a little smoother today than you were 20 years ago? I hope you are. I hope you are. I hope God is sanding off your rough edges. So the saga of an ancient people, this is the Old Testament, struggling to survive in a world where food was scarce, enemies were real, and death was just a minor infection away. They clung to God, and God clung to them. Careful never to override their freedom. See, it's history, friends, but it's history with you in mind. Then some 2,000, maybe 200 years later, a young girl would give birth to a young boy, a baby, and the fulfillment of all of this would begin. And then a man by the name of Paul would come along, and he would summarize it kind of like this. Are you ready? But when the set time had fully come, in other words, when everything was in place, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law that was given to Moses, the law that played the tutor, as it were, until the new lawmaker steps onto the pages of history to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. See, friends, the Old Testament is epic. Epic. And we should be so thankful for it. There's no need to clean it up. So here we are, 2nd century. There's still no the Bible. 100 and maybe 60 years after Jesus, there's still no Bible. The Jesus followers had adopted Jewish scriptures for themselves. There were some other documents from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that were kind of floating around. There were some letters from Paul that he would send to these churches that he founded for particular reasons. And God had established a new covenant with the nation. Jesus said there'll be an inauguration in his blood. And they didn't understand what that meant. But again, up to this point, there's still no Bible. Just some Hebrew text and some stories of Jesus, his death and resurrection. And then these correspondence from this missionary, Paul. And that's where we pick up next week. I hope you'll be here for it. Thanks, friends. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this amazing, amazing collection of documents. It's mind-blowing when you really understand it in its entirety and how it came about. And God, thank you for this opportunity that I have to share this with my friends and for us to get a fuller awareness of, God, what you're doing in all of history through mankind. God, help us to absorb it. Help us to understand it, to get it deep in our spirit, God, that you are a God who saves. And God, that you love us. And you'll never, ever, 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 ever leave us. We thank you in your name. Amen. Amen. Thanks, friends. Have a great day.